So, recent research has found that not only does the brain communicate with our cells, but that our cells also communicate with our brain and other parts of our body, right? So, the latest discoveries by scientists are revealing that we think we know more about the brain. We think with our body as well as our brain. So we've talked about this in a couple of episodes ago that the heart mind actually is quicker at responding to emotion and to thoughts than our head mind. And a lot of the work that we do, Chris and I do, and what we're doing at Wisdom from the Edge is helping kind of bridge that gap between the heart and head coherence so that there's more of a connection. It is not accurate to look at our entire body as being a part of our brain. That may be new and startling, but before you reject that, let's dive a little deeper into it. So as we were saying earlier, that there is such a thing as we talked about last week, is that our body has its own intelligence. And here in the book that I'm reading called Zen and the Art of Happiness by Chris Prentice. It's a beautiful little book. But in this book, it actually goes pretty deep into, this body-brain concept. And so there is a key part of our body's incredible communication system that involves our cell receptors. And every cell in our body has millions of receptors on its face. And each cell has perhaps 70 different types of receptors. Okay. So if we look at a cell, we've got millions of little teeny microscopic receptors around that. In the early 1970s, Dr. Candace Pert was the first scientist to prove the existence of these receptors with her discovery of the opiate receptor, which is really, really fascinating. So these receptor molecules float on the cell's oily outer membrane and have roots that reach deep inside the cell. And she has an amazing book that I actually have read called The Molecules of Emotion. And what she is saying is that the life of a cell, what it's up to at any moment, is determined by which receptors are on its surface and whether those receptors are occupied by ligands or not. So these ligands are this small molecule that binds itself to the cellular receptors. It's kind of like glue. So if I just kind of go down a little bit, because I don't want to get too granular into this thing, we're going to talk about peptides for a second. And what we know about peptides is that they are produced in the hypothalamus. And our hypothalamus is this amazing gland that sits at the center of our brain. And that the type of peptide produced is primarily determined by what we think and how we feel. The hypothalamus produces peptides that duplicate every emotion that we have. And so we can think about it. We're feeling anger, we're feeling frustration, we're feeling, sadness, depression, or joy, and enthusiasm and happiness and curiosity. So the peptides are channeled to the pituitary gland and then it goes into our bloodstream, where they visit all 20 to 30 trillion cells in our body. Peptides dock onto these cells and create minute physiological phenomenon that translate to larger changes in the behavior, our physical activity, and even our mood. So what does this mean? So what Dr. Pert said is that these peptides play an incredible role in regulating the practicality of life and the way in which we process things. When the peptides dock onto the receptors, they take control of the cell's activity, including commanding whether or not it will divide and the composition of a new cell. Okay. So it's like a captain of a ship stepping on board and beginning to give orders. I don't know, viewer, if you have been familiar with a somewhat underground documentary that came out in 2003 called What the Bleep Do We Know? And there were a lot of now very famous people who were in that documentary, including Dr. Joe Dispenza. And the way Dispenza explained things was that when a new cell is produced, it doesn't always clone what the old cell did, but a cell that contains more receptors for whatever peptide it received that caused it to split. So, what does that mean? It means that if the cell received peptides produced by emotions of depression, the new cell that has more receptors for depression, the fewer cells receptors to receive a feeling good peptide then occurs. So whatever emotion we are feeling, and by the way, there are 300 million cells that die every minute. Whatever receptors are the more prevalent based on our emotions, those dead cells then get reproduced to the receptors that are most prevalent. Therefore, how we think and how we feel are so amazingly important. And that's so much of the work that we do, because oftentimes we're not even aware of how we think. We're not even aware of how we feel. So the body is still generating all of these receptors. But if we're not aware that we're feeling really anxious and we're holding on to anxiety, or our thoughts are ruminating about something that happened yesterday in an argument with your spouse, you're going to be producing more and more of those receptors. So if you're feeling depressed for an hour or upset or angry, you've produced approximately 18 billion new cells that have more receptors calling out for depressive type peptides and fewer feeling good peptides.
Wow. That's like, just to take a quick step back for a second for our audience, because it's a lot to digest, but it's also so, it explains so much. It's like when I was moving through some of my more like bouts of depression in my mid-20s, it took sometimes months just to get out of one cycle of it, or like it took sometimes long time. And, even in those moments, it would feel like, when the hell is this ever gonna end? When am I gonna feel differently? And I'm sure everyone watching and listening can probably think of some point in their life when this has been the case. And I think it's like I'm picking up two sort of things. One, it's to kind of in a way give yourself a break if you're in one of these cycles where you're in a cycle of, let's say, depression or addiction or anger, frustration, whatever that is. And it's like, okay, well, then no wonder it's challenging to move out of these situations, because it's clearly a physiological issue as much as it is an emotional and mental issue, because your body's now being given literally new cells that reinforce this emotion that you might not want to be reinforced. So it's also, at one point for me, I'm hearing like, give yourself a break, because you're actually working through a pretty challenging situation within your own physical body. But then at the other end of the spectrum, there's so many millions of cells dying every minute and every second that there's also the opportunity to shift that and to change that and to move and to slowly, or not so slowly, shift that frequency and that state of being on an emotional sense and a mental sense, so that it also physiologically shifts your whole body into that new new way of being, because we're emotional beings. Like, we're still going to feel everything, but if we're aware of it, I think that's maybe the third thing I picked up from this too, is the awareness. If we're aware of this, then it allows us that power and capability to shift and retrain ourselves in doing so to feel maybe these new emotions. Those are kind of
Yeah.
like takeaways I got from that.
Well, there's one more piece to this, which is even more astounding, I think. Not only um, are these receptors and the cells that are being produced that are favoring the majority of what the receptors or these peptides are picking up based on how we're thinking and feeling. But it creates the need for more of the same thoughts. So we become addicted to the thoughts and the feelings that we have. And let's just, for listeners, I'm sure you may have heard this before, but the more feelings we have of being upset or angry or depressed, the more we're going to have thoughts around that. And the more we have thoughts around those feelings or those thoughts, they're going to pick up feelings. And then our feelings are going to create more thoughts, and our thoughts going to create more feelings. And so this is a loop. It's very hard to get out of. But what science is discovering, or have discovered, and Dr. Pert has discovered, is that our bodies are becoming addicted to receiving more of those receptors. And that is why it is so challenging to get out of what we're not feeling good about